Okay, so for today's deep dive, we're going to try to get a better understanding of Charlotte, North Carolina,
Mm-hmm.
specifically its neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And we all know how it is when you move to a new city, right?
Totally.
It can be so overwhelming, all those choices.
So many.
In a place like Charlotte, it just seems like, it just seems huge, right?
It's massive. I mean, with tons of these distinct areas, right? Like, how do you even begin?
And there's no shortage of those, like those, what are they called? Listicles, right?
Yeah.
Top 10 neighborhoods in Charlotte
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
and that kind of thing. But honestly, they're usually pretty surface level.
Yeah.
And they don't really give you a good understanding of what it would actually be like
Right. Right.
to actually live in one of those places.
Exactly.
So, so what we're trying to do today is go beyond that,
Right.
right? We're going to go beyond just like the basic descriptions
Mm-hmm.
to really get at the DNA, I guess, like the fundamental vibe of each neighborhood.
Yes. That's the
So to help us out today, we're using Charlotte, NC, a guide to the best neighborhoods.
great guide.
Yeah, so let's jump in.
Awesome.
So one thing that struck me when I was looking at this guide was how it talks about each neighborhood as if it's like almost like its own mini city,
It's true.
right? With its own personality, its own culture.
Yeah, it's not just about the buildings, right? It's the overall atmosphere and the people and how they interact.
Right. And that thing is like, how do you even explain that, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm just looking at this guide here and it says Noda has this, quote, artistic energy.
Okay.
But what does that actually mean if you're thinking of like living there?
So let's unpack that a little.
Okay.
I think when they talk about Noda, it's really about the sheer number of art galleries,
Right.
working studios where artists are actually making art, and
Yeah.
of course the live music venues.
Oh, right.
And they're all kind of crammed into this one little area.
Okay.
So you could easily walk down the street and see murals on the walls, hear music spilling out of, a club,
Yeah.
and it creates this really creative, I don't know, like a buzz.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's a vibe. And so for someone living there, it's like, well, hey, maybe you can just catch a live show whenever you want,
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
or spend an afternoon just browsing art, just soaking it all up. So
Yeah.
that's kind of what that artistic energy really translates to.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then there's Dilworth, which the guide describes as having all these charming bungalows.
Oh, yeah.
And again, it's like, okay, that sounds nice, but where does that charm actually come from?
Well, with Dilworth, it's interesting because it's really tied to its history as one of Charlotte's, first streetcar suburbs. So back in the early 20th century, that's when they built a lot of those classic bungalows
Oh, okay.
with like the big porches and all those craftsman
I know
details.
those houses, yeah.
Yeah, they're so cool.
Yeah.
And then you add in all the mature trees and it just creates this, I don't know, it's very established, almost nostalgic,
It's cozy, yeah.
It's cozy.
Yeah.
And that kind of environment really seems to foster a strong sense of community, people out walking their dogs, actually knowing their neighbors.
Yeah, like a real neighborhood feel.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
it's not just about the houses themselves, but the whole lifestyle
Yeah.
that makes sense that
Yeah.
they encourage.
Okay, so another interesting thing this guide says is that choosing a neighborhood is really about like finding a, quote, thriving part of your life narrative.
Ooh, I like that.
It's a very evocative way to put it, right?
It is.
I don't know, it makes you think about how your surroundings really do affect like your daily routines and stuff,
They do.
right? Like imagine if you live in a neighborhood where there's tons of cafes and shops and stuff within walking distance.
Right, and you could just pop in.
That's like, oh, I'm just going to run out and grab a coffee, as opposed to like having to get in your car and drive everywhere.
It's a completely different experience.
Yeah.
Right. One is much more spontaneous.
Yeah, and I feel like it's more social too.
Absolutely.
Like you actually bump into people that
Yeah. Yeah, it's about connection.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so it sounds like what we're calling this core vibe is really just like a bunch of different things combined.
Mm-hmm.
It's the architecture, the culture, the community,
Exactly.
even like walkability and access to amenities.
It all feeds into it.
All right.
And I mean, the architecture sets a tone, right? Like we were saying, Dilworth has this historic charm.
Yeah.
But you go to like a newer development, it's probably going to have a much more modern feel. And then you layer on the culture, right?
Yeah.
Are there art galleries, music venues, cool restaurants, local businesses?
And all of that really contributes to the vibe.
It does.
Like I bet you wouldn't find that same late night energy
Right.
that you get in South End, with all the breweries and the nightlife.
Mhm.
You wouldn't find that in like a quiet suburban neighborhood.
Not at all.
Totally different.
Yeah, you get a very different energy.
Yeah, and this is where it starts to get tricky, right?
It does.
Because it's like, on the one hand, you have all these practical things to consider,
Yeah.
like, schools,
Yeah, think about the
your
schools.
commute budget, of course.
Of course.
But then there's this other, like, more intangible
Right.
element, which is, do I feel like I belong here?
Yeah.
Is this, like, my kind of place?
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's where understanding that core vibe is so important.
Huge.
So hopefully this deep dive is helpful for you because, once you have a better understanding of those fundamental characteristics,
Right.
it's much easier to filter through all the options.
Yeah, it's like you can finally start narrowing it down.
Yeah, and then, really focus on the areas that actually fit
Fit your lifestyle.
your lifestyle. Yeah, your priorities.
Exactly.
And it's more than just like making a list of pros and cons.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like, do you get that feeling, right? That gut feeling that this is my place.
I think that's so important.
It is.
Yeah, that's what this guide is really getting at, right?
Yeah.
It's about thinking holistically
Mm-hmm.
about what you want in a community.
So big takeaway here is Charlotte is not like a one-size-fits-all kind of city.
Not at all.
It's all these distinct neighborhoods,
Mm-hmm.
each with its own story, its own vibe.
Its own history.
Right, its own history, yeah.
Yeah, and the people who live there are part of that story too.
Absolutely, and understanding that is so, so important.
So key.
Yeah, when it comes to actually finding a place where you're going to feel at home,
Connected.
connected, yeah.
That's what it's all about.
Okay, so we've got this framework now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Charlotte is all about these distinct neighborhoods, each with its own vibe.
Yes.
And we're using this guide as our map, so to speak.
Yeah.
So as we continue this deep dive, keep those practical considerations in mind.
Yeah.
The schools, the commute, all that good stuff.
Kind of practical.
You do, and see how those things line up with,
the character of each neighborhood.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because every place is different.
Okay, so let's keep exploring these Charlotte neighborhoods, shall we?
Let's do it. There's so much more to uncover.
As we start to wrap up this initial exploration into Charlotte's neighborhoods, one thing that really sticks out for me is this idea that the city is really like a collection of little villages.
I love that. Yeah,
Almost, right? Each with its own rhythm, its
Yeah.
own feel.
absolutely.
It's not just about finding a place to live, it's about finding a place that speaks to you,
Yeah, where you can see yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
And what I really appreciate about this guide is how it kind of encourages you to think about like what you want out of life.
Yep.
It's really pushing you to consider what kind of environment is going to support, the life you want to build.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about the physical space. It's about like the potential for connection,
Right.
a sense of belonging.
And I know we keep talking about it, but those practical considerations,
Mm-hmm.
like your commute,
Yeah.
the school district, they're obviously important.
Of course, you have to think about those things.
Right, but this guide, it really seems to emphasize
It does.
that understanding the vibe.
The atmosphere.
Yeah.
The culture.
The culture, the community spirit,
all of it.
all of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just as crucial.
I think it's key.
Yeah, to your long-term happiness.
It's huge.
Because ultimately, you want to feel at home.
That's the goal.
You want to feel like you belong.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and this brings up, a really important question as
Okay.
we're thinking about all these unique stories and the core vibes.
Yeah.
Whether it's a place with a super artistic energy or a historic neighborhood,
Mm.
what kind of life narrative do you want to create for yourself
Wow, yeah.
in a Charlotte neighborhood, right? What kind of environment, would really help you thrive and feel connected?
It's a powerful question.
It is.
And that's something to really think about as you're, exploring your options.
Absolutely.
And that's all the time we have for today, so we'll pick this back up in our next deep dive.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, see you then.
See you then.